Hi, this is Derek from Volition Recording Studios. For those of you who don't know, I recently released my book and it's going to be over here. And pretty much this book is designed for the beginner in mind, but there's definitely some intermediate practices and applications that I think will be very beneficial for all levels. Please go check that out because this is going to be a video on one of the topics I'll be going over from the ebook. Alright, so we're going to get into probably the most boringest chapter of my ebook, but probably the most important at the same time. And what I'm talking about is preparing and setting up your DAW. It's very important to not only get your DAW to be set up the proper way, you can avoid any unforeseen mistakes or issues that you might encounter during your music production sessions. So whether you're recording, mixing, or mastering, you want it is meant to be. So the first thing I want to talk about is your setup. So meaning your computer, laptop, whatever it is, make sure that it has the basic specs on it. So stuff you want to look into is your memory, your RAM, and just your space. So make sure that you have sufficient enough specs for your computer or laptop. So as long as you have pretty good memory and RAM, it should be able to handle a lot of the plugins, and pretty much the processing speed is a lot more smoother. You want to make sure that your computer is powerful enough, because that also future-proofs any future updates from your DAW. Please check your DAW specs and compare that with your computer. So the second thing I want to mention about that you are using the right connections. So what I mean by that is head over to your DAW, check out the, in my case, is Cubase, but make sure that the input and output of your audio interface to your computer or PC is routed and connected in the proper route. Because there's many cases where I'm pretty sure most of everyone that's probably watching this video, or if you're working from home, wherever you're producing music, you want to you're going to have the tendency to probably plug it to your computer speakers, maybe to your monitors if you got one. So you're going to be switching back and forth a lot, and it's very important to make sure that you're always connected in the right settings before you start your session. Or maybe you just finish, let's just say you're on the road, you recorded something with your DAW, but now you're back home, you have your monitors and your computer set up at your home studio. When you go to connect that, check for that, make sure everything's connected correctly. You don't want to waste time and be like, why is this not working, when it's really something as silly as just checking the connection. So I would highly say this is probably number 2, probably the most important thing to check, to make sure the input and output is connected to the right and routed correctly. The third thing I want to mention about is, this is a pretty big one, and a lot of beginners, including myself sometimes, that we run into this issue called audio latency. So you can think of it as being delay. So you want to make sure that the delay is set up and calibrated in a way where it's not too fast or too slow. So you want to make sure that your latency falls in a good sweet spot. So you want to make sure to check your audio latency. So you want to go over, check your DAW. Alright, so depending on what DAW you use, you want to make sure that the settings are correct for it, and generally it'll look a little bit different depending on what DAW you use, but you want to make sure that everything's looking right to you. You want to make sure that the latency is reasonable. I have some specs written right here on the side for you, so just as a quick reference, anytime you know you're going to be doing any recording, you want your latency to be as low as possible. So anywhere within 5 to 6 milliseconds is considered to be really reasonable for recording. So anytime you want to do any type of processing, in which case I mix, so when you want to make sure to check for is when your audio latency is at a pretty good range, I'll say about like 10 to 25 milliseconds will be kind of a reasonable amount of latency space. So what that does is that allows more processing, and make sure that you go check these latencies before you throw anything on to begin with. Alright, and pretty much the next thing I want to talk about, which is very important, not only having your setups correctly, checking for those basic things, but you also want to make sure that your DAW is set up the way you want it to look. You want to make sure that you're either in bars, seconds, or you want to make sure that you're using grid to make sure things are locked in, and make sure that your DAW looks the way you want it to, so it's easier to access things. so you're not guessing where they are. So what I mean by this as well, when you set up your work session, pretty much you want to make sure that your tracks are organized and color coded, which is really important too. So what this does is it speeds up your workflow, and you don't have to be guessing where the guitars are. Once you finish your mix, try to create a template out of it. So this is also very helpful. And by creating a template, what this does is it already has some pre-saved things in terms of color coding on, and it's just generally really helpful, so you don't always have to pop in your EQ or compression. As you can see, all the settings from for that previous mix is there, and all you need to do is just make any quick adjustments without wasting time and just load your tracks. And then pretty much the final thing to wrap things up, to just conclude everything is in the right proper order, is to make sure that your files and your stem files, your tracks, and all your audio file is in the right spots. I find this being probably the most important thing, even before like everything I mentioned before, is to make sure that the files are set up correctly so things are being saved in the right spot. I have made mistakes where I was about to mix a song, and then I noticed that when I was doing some type of, as one would call it, cleaning up, tidying up files, deleting what I feel like is just useless, I accidentally deleted some stem files from that mix. So I wasn't able to retrieve that mix ever again, and I had to start from scratch. So please don't make the same mistake as I do. Make sure that you save your files in the right spot. You can actually do that by checking your DAW by how it's routed and where it's saved to. You can actually set that out and make sure you can avoid those mistakes. And pretty much the last thing I want to mention is make sure to label your sessions, so it makes it easier for you to understand what it is, what you did on that day, and you can go back to it whenever you want. So in the future, if you notice maybe you did a type of editing that you liked, but then you went with something else, you can always go back to that editing because you have a file of it and you saved it earlier. So it's also a very good habit to create different files depending on what you do on that day. So that's a great practice that I highly advocate to beginners, to even intermediate or advanced people, is to make sure just don't have one file that pretty much is everything, because that will cause a lot of issues. And if you want to go back and reference or to use any of that, it's
too bad. So sad.
You can't, because you don't have backup files for those. So I highly recommend, as an advanced practice, to create multiple templates. Alright, so I know this is probably the most boringest session. There's not a whole lot of action in terms of what I'm using with the DAW, but generally I feel like it's more important to set it up the correct way first before you do any type of music production, because it will just make things easier. It's almost like having a very good guitar in the case where it motivates you that it's set up so it's being played easily. B, it's just more polished, it's easier to access, and you're more motivated to actually play the guitar. So the same thing with the DAW. The more time you spend on making sure these little things are taken care of, the easier it will be to record music, to mix, to master, and you shouldn't really run into any issues. Alright, so that wraps it up for today. Thank you very much for watching this video. I know this is a bit boring, and I thank those of you that watched it all this way. If you liked what you saw today, please consider subscribing, liking, and doing the YouTube jazz, because this helps me bring out more videos and recommend more of my videos out to people that might need help in this area. So thank you very much. You guys enjoy the rest of your day. See you later.